All right, welcome to the discussion. We are with Carlo Lancellotti, who is professor of mathematics at the College of Staten Island. But in his spare time, he is the translator from Italian into English of the works of Augusto del Noce, a 20th century Italian philosopher who analyzed what he referred to as revolutionary thought. And I want to read just a sentence here about Del Noce, that Del Noce maintained that 20th century history must be understood specifically as a philosophical history because Western culture was profoundly affected by the major philosophies of the previous century, such as idealism, Marxism, and positivism. So here to talk to us a little bit today about these ideas and about revolutionary thought is Carlo Lancellotti. Welcome, Carlo.
Oh, thank you, Eduardo. Thanks for having me.
So why don't we start out, could you give us a little bit about the context in which Del Noce was writing?
Yeah, Del Noce was the generation who came of age under fascism because he was born in 1910. And so when he was 12, Mussolini rose to power, and then also at the time the Russian Revolution was unfolding. And so when he was in his 20s, that was the time of the Stalinist purges, the rise of Hitler, the 1930s. It was very hard to live through the 1930s, and contemporary history was so dramatic that it really shaped a lot of his philosophical questions. He's not an abstract philosopher, he's really a philosopher of history. So his concern is to understand the ideas that mold history, if you know what I mean. And so a lot of his work is dedicated to understanding Marxism and all the responses to Marxism, because he did think that Marxism was the protagonist of the 20th century from an ideological, philosophical perspective. And he thought that most other philosophical movements and political movements like fascism, Nazism, and then also the Western culture after the war cannot be understood if not in reference to Marxism and to Leninism and the Russian Revolution. So that's why his books are very hands-on, right? You always see it, there is it's philosophical, but with a concern towards politics and history.
How was Del Noce commenting on fascism within his Italian context? What was his reaction there?
Well, he was an anti-fascist, but he was an anti-fascist with a pacifist, more ethical bent, which distinguished it, made him kind of a loner, because, first of all, most anti-fascists at the time were secular, like the socialists, the communists, certain type of radical liberals, they were anti-fascist. And Del Noce was Catholic. And Catholics had a kind of ambivalent attitude towards Marxists because, Catholics of his generation still kind of grew up in the cultural atmosphere of the 19th century, in which the two great enemies of the church were socialism and liberalism, right? If you think of, for instance, Donoso Cortes, that kind of author, Donoso Cortes believes that, there is this one behemoth of anti-Catholicism that is first liberal and then evolves into socialist. The two phenomena are kind of continuous to each other. And so if you look at fascism, what were the two big enemies of fascism? Well, socialism and liberalism. So you see that for a Catholic, Mussolini presented himself as somebody who had the same enemies. And so, there is the principle that the enemy of my enemies is at least potentially my friend. And this created a difficulty for Catholics because, of course, Mussolini was very secular. He was himself a former revolutionary socialist, a libertine, a womanizer, and previously very strongly anti-Catholic in his socialist stage. But he was the enemy of their enemies. And so how can you criticize fascism if he's anti-liberal, anti-socialist, and you have been anti-liberal, anti-socialist all your life? It created a problem. So the hope that Italian Catholics kind of developed in front of Mussolini was that it could be a stepping stone, that it could be like a attack dog, that it would kind of destroy liberalism and socialism, and then what? And then we step on the stage and go back to the 13th century. There was kind of this medievalist ideal of recreating the great age of medieval Christendom. And even if, of course, Mussolini had nothing to do with that, Mussolini seemed to be able to clear the way for a Catholic restoration, because he was kind of a rough guy. He was not clear if he had any ideas of himself. And so we can provide them, right? After Mussolini does the destructive action against the liberals and the socialists, we can provide the foundations of a new Christian civilization. That idea was extremely tempting to Catholics at that time. And there are some echoes of that idea today, too, if you look for it, among a certain type of Catholic. And of course, it didn't work, but it was a big quandary for people. And Del Noce was not a secular anti-fascist, but was not at home even with his fellow Catholics for that reason, because Del Noce held a fundamentally moral objection to fascism. That after the Ethiopian War, the Spanish War, it showed that fascism was ruthless, that it was justifying violence, and that it did kind of establish a truce with the church with the Lateran Treaties of 1929, but it was purely instrumental. It was an attempt to use the church. Mussolini certainly wanted to use the church for his own power, but certainly he didn't share in the ideals of Christianity. And so then, if you read his books, Del Noce goes on and on to try to analyze what was Mussolini's real ideology and why it was incompatible with Christianity. But certainly at the time, his position made him very isolated in the 30s.
When I read Del Noce, I get the sense that he has a very strong distinction between a sort of traditionalism and a sort of revolutionary thought. And fascism, liberalism, and Marxism could all in many ways be understood as kind of manifestations of revolutionary thought. Could you take us into a little bit of what Del Noce means when he talks about the revolutionary tradition?
Yes, for him, the revolutionary tradition has its prototype in Marxism, although the remote roots go back to Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, he was the first to theorize that what's wrong with people is society's fault, right? And that people were born free and then they are in chains. If you change society, people will become good. So there was a theological undercurrent of Pelagianism, just the Noce says. Pelagianism, the idea that human nature is fundamentally good. The problem is a inadequate or wrong social organization. So if you change the social organization, there's nothing wrong about human nature, no original sin that will prevent happiness on earth. And so in Rousseau, this idea of, this is where the root of the revolutionary concept is, which is already expressed before Marx in the Jacobins of the French Revolution, like Robespierre, right? There is the idea that we can make a qualitative step forward in which we are going to fix the problem of society, and then happiness will become possible on earth, right? But then this kind of Rousseauian intuition gets really expanded and powered up in Marx and gets associated with atheism, right? Because for the Noce, Marx is also the prototype of modern atheism, in as much it corresponds to a different idea of man as self-creator, man as determined, as work, as builder that creates himself or herself through work. And it also gets mixed up with a certain Gnostic flavor coming from the German philosophical tradition, from Hegel, that views history as having a direction, right? The direction of history. Like in Hegel, history is the progressive self-manifestation of the spirit of the world that comes to fulfillment in Hegel, or if not in Hegel, as a person in the great modern European civilization, right? Which is the fulfillment of God, in some sense, of God immanent in history, not transcendent. And so in Marx, all these things come together and create this thing that the Noce calls revolutionary thought, which is this expectation of a radical change, which there's going to be a break in history in which the new age will come, the old world will pass away, and there will be human self-sufficiency and human happiness on earth. And the idea of God will be totally unnecessary, because the idea of God was just an expression of human's mystery. People came up with the idea of God because they were oppressed. But when you remove the oppression, you don't need to even deny the idea of God. It will just evaporate, right? It will just evaporate naturally, because there will be happiness on earth. So in this sense, too, the Noce Marx is the prototype of revolutionary thought. And then for him, fascism and Nazism and a certain type of liberalism, like the one that we are experiencing after World War II, are in a sense repercussions of this new type of Marxist atheism in different ways, and they're all different. So I don't know if we want to talk about any of them in particular.
Well, let's do first. You mentioned earlier that he saw Marxism as sort of the protagonist in the last couple of centuries, and obviously not protagonist as the good guy, but the sort of mover of events,
yes,
as it were. Could you explain us a little bit what you mean by that?
Well, what I think he means is that most of 20th century history, European history, started in 1917. In 1917, Lenin had kind of rebrought Marxists to the fore and went to power in a major country, Russia, which paradoxically was the country that Marx least expected to become communist, because Karl Marx saw that the revolution would happen, I think, first in France, then in England, and finally in Germany, and that Russia was a backward country. So you know that Marx expected the revolution to be the final fruit of mature capitalism. At the end, when capitalism became completely mature, its contradictions would make it blow up and would bring out to communism. So the last place where the revolution was supposed to happen was Russia, because Russia was the least capitalistic, the most industrially backward European country. So against Marx's expectations, Marxism came to power in Russia, and to the Noce, then a lot of what happened afterwards in the 20s and 30s was a response to Marxism, different kind of responses. To him, Mussolini was kind of an imitator. Mussolini wanted to be the Lenin of the West. Mussolini wanted to be the European Lenin in a more mature, more civilized context, like the Western European context. And instead, to the Noce, Hitler is like the mirror image of Stalin. It is the radical anti-communist that replaces the historical revolution with a naturalistic revolution, because that in Marx, the revolution is the product of history, while in Hitler is the affirmation of nature, of the race, the Aryan race. And so it's a kind of a naturalistic, biological transposition of communism. That's Del Noce's view of Nazis. Then after their defeat, and to Del Noce, Nazis and fascism are very different phenomena, even if they were allied for various reasons. They enter into an alliance, but philosophically they were not the same. And then after the war, as a response to the rise of Soviet power, in Del Noce's view, the West organized itself by adopting certain aspects of Marxism, like materialism, the primacy of economics, of the economic factor in the life of society, a certain relativism whereby ethics and morality are just expression of material historical forces, while rejecting the religious revolutionary aspect of Marxism, this expectation of the heaven on earth, the expectation of the revolution, right? So to him also the culture of what he calls the affluent society, right, the Western society after World War II centered in the United States, is somehow a response to Marxism, is shaped by Marxism in this process of decomposition, of taking some aspects of Marxism, the one I listed before, while rejecting the revolutionary religious aspect of Marxism. So you see that because of all these links and of action and reaction, Del Noce thought that Marxism was the protagonist and everything else was a bit of a response to it. And the formula he uses is this idea that I already mentioned of the decomposition, that Marxism had these two contradictory aspects of, on one hand, materialism, affirming that history is determined by economic material forces, and so morality is relative, the truth is relative, it's always the expression of a social, economic context. There is no absolute truth, there is no absolute morality, it's always conditioned by social conditions. And on the other hand, there was this romantic Gnostic expectation of the new age, of the reign of freedom, the advent of heaven on earth. And what Del Noce means by decomposition is that these two things split because they are contradictory. Because if you apply this critique, the historically materialistic critique, you can apply to Marxism itself, then the whole idea of revolution, you recognize it as a pipe dream, right? And this is what the sociologists in the West of the 50s and 60s did. If you look at the great American sociologists of the 50s and 60s, they criticized Marxism on that ground of being a bad social theory, of having this religion of the revolution that was never going to happen. But at the same time, they were Marxists themselves in the other aspect, in the aspect of relativism, of materialism, of the supremacy of economics. So in this sense, the two aspects of Marxism split, and the West picked up one aspect.
Right. So in other words, if the world is just material, then how can there be a teleology leading to an ideal state, right? It's just as likely to fall into chaos as to come to something good. And that's, it's interesting, you talk about the West sort of taking in, I guess, the Marxist materialist aspect, but chucking the idealistic. And so when you describe the affluent society, take us a little bit more about what you mean by that, and maybe even like, are we seeing it today? Is that something that we're living with?
We are probably in the final stage of this phenomenon. To him, really things came to a new synthesis in the West in the late 50s, right? Because in the early 60s, because still in the 40s and the 50s, people opposed communists, for example, often making an appeal to Christian civilization, right? If you read the authors immediately after the war, from the older generation, they will still refer to a Christian civilization. The West is a Christian civilization. But then if you look at the age of after 1955, you think of the more technocratic young Turks or the Kennedy administration, that kind of generation. For them, they believed in the supremacy of science, including social science, and that society should be led by technocrats, by experts, by them, essentially, right? But their faith in technocracy, in science, was not contradictory to a certain aspect of Marxism, because even Marx expected that in the end, everything was driven by the means of production. Means of production means technology, science, and applied to economics, of course. But so if you look at that generation, then the rhetoric against the Soviet Union shifted, and the idea became, we are going to beat the Soviet Union by being more secular, by being more scientific, by being more materially advanced, by giving everybody more televisions and microwave ovens and refrigerators and cars and highways and suburbs. And this will defeat communism. And it worked. Okay, I'm not saying it didn't work, because in a sense, communism was defeated by the superior material power of the West to bring about bourgeois well-being for the masses, right? And so it worked. But philosophically, it embraced this relativistic, materialistic aspect that Marx already included, that Marxism already contained.
There's a quote here that I wanna bring just at this point in the conversation from the book, and by the way, just to share with our viewers, The Crisis of Modernity, which is a series of essays of Del Noce, and I think the first work, right, Carlo, that you translated?
Yes, I translated so far. 2 have been published, and there's a 3rd coming out this December.
Excellent. So Del Noce writes, colonization can be achieved by only one method, by uprooting a people from its traditions. Europeans have a long history of extensively practicing this method, and this was Europe's greatest historical fault. Now, oh wonder, in order to feign regret, they are applying the same method to themselves. Since this process of self-uprooting was conjoined with well-being, what could remain standing in the end, except for economic organizations, which could be turned into vassals, and whose fidelity would be ensured by the leftist parties. So to me, this captures so well what I really loved, and which no pun intended, revolutionized my thinking when I came across Del Noce, which was this wasn't just a left versus right critique of Marxism or of revolutionary thought. This is saying the Western post-World War II liberal spirit was no longer Christian civilization. It was a revolutionary civilization in a capitalist and free world key,
Right.
which is opposed to traditional society and the sort of eternal values which have always underwritten that, and is just as much a principle of disintegration as any other form of revolutionary thought.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you put it very well. What else to say? I mean, Del Noce thinks that there is a more modern idea of revolution, which is the idea of a technical, scientific revolution in which it wipes away superstition and goes back, in a sense, to the culture of the old French Enlightenment, Condorcet, those guys, the idea that never-ending scientific and technical progress will sweep away the old superstitions and create the real revolution, not the Marxist revolution. And to some extent, this idea of a technical scientific revolution is still with us in the West. I mean, it's still pretty common. And it's really the defining line. I mean, Del Noce doesn't buy that the opposition between right and left. To him, the opposition between people who hold, let's say, a traditional, but also not just, is not just traditional. What he thinks is a deeper idea of humanity as made in the image of God, so that they cannot just be satisfied by material improvements, and they also are not just individuals, but live in relationship between themselves, among themselves, and with God. And this more modern idea of the affluent society, of the individual who builds himself through his work and achieves earthly happiness without asking questions, essentially, because all you need to do is to take advantage of all these useful things and create your own happiness and be the self-made man. And then this presents itself as liberalism. But Del Noce kind of questions the use of the word liberalism after the 1960s, because to him there was a more traditional idea of liberalism that was simply an extension of natural law, right? The kind of the European and Christian ideas of natural law, human dignity, and in some sense produced to a sort of liberalism in a broader sense. While what calls himself liberalism in the post-World War context is really this kind of bourgeois individualism, right? Which of course existed before too, but now it becomes extreme. But not just this idea that Marxism kind of freed the bourgeois individualistic culture from the shackles of Christianity. That if you look at the 19th century, there was a bourgeois culture, there was individualism in its especially in Protestant countries that, but it was still kind of fettered. It was still kind of constrained by certain Christian ethics, Christian morality, maybe in Kantian secularized form. And the Marxist critique of the family, of the church, of liberal education, the kind of critique you see everywhere today, right, when everything is criticized as being oppressive, produce the true bourgeois, the true individual who creates himself or herself and pursues happiness in an individualized, instinctive, material sense.
So the bourgeois revolution is kind of the unshackled from religion, from family, from your community, and just free kind of to undertake pleasure maximizing commercial activity and in a sense, I guess, to create the rest of the society in your own image, right?
Well, in a sense, society is no longer a society, because, from the Noce's perspective, what makes a society is that people share some ideals, some a common idea what it means to be a human being that is not just this kind of individualistic fulfillment, right? A good idea of a good life that kind of disappeared. I mean, and so to him, what happened in the 60s with the sexual revolution was a transposition of the idea of revolution from a collective historical perspective to an individualistic, naturalistic revolution, right? The idea of the sexual revolution is not that the society will be changed, but that the individual will be freed, right? And freed to follow the instincts, ultimately. I mean, to follow his true self. The idea of the true self is still very, very common. You see that Marx would have been horrified by that, because to Marx, humans are social creatures, and this idea of the true self unrelated to society would have been a blasphemy. But paradoxically, that's where it ended, right? And so this is another one of these ironies of history.
And there's the cultural dimension that he calls to as well with art, for example, in discussing surrealism.
Mm-hmm.
I think referred to it as art in service of the revolution. Could you talk a little bit about how maybe artistic expression and plays into this question?
Yes, I'm no expert on that particular aspect, but the Noce does regard surrealism as kind of one of the sources of the sexual revolution, in as much it really affirmed this opposition in the individual and society, and it affirmed that the denial of the past, that you radically have to free yourself from the past and from all conventions and from even artistic conventions, and to offend, in some sense, to affirm yourself. Now, this is a little bit of an oversimplification, because, as I said, I'm no expert on the matter, but yes, if you're in the book, one of the essays, the Noce goes on at length why he thinks that surrealism was kind of the driver, not the driver in the sense that people were familiar with the surrealists, but it was the first expression, was kind of a prototypical expression of the culture that became dominant in the 1960s. And in fact, when he talks about, the student rebellion of the 1968, he says it was sort of a surrealist revolution, in as much it was the liberation of the instincts, that from the family, from social convention, from all those things. He thought that all those ideas were already present in the surrealists 20 years earlier.
Taking this to the international context a little bit, my sense is that Del Noce was very interested when he saw things like the Iranian Revolution happening, and maybe there was a bit of a sense there. I think he refers to America as the principle of disintegration, right? And that Europe sort of follows it, I guess, after the war down that bourgeois path that kind of dissolves its own tradition, as we saw in the quote. But in some ways, wasn't the Iranian Revolution sort of an instantiation of a reaction to that sort of global?
Yeah, he doesn't write at length about it, but he mentions it in the appendix to the book. There is an interview where he says that paradoxically today, Ayatollah Khomeini, is the only one who can motivate people to go to the front line, because it was the time of the Iran-Iraq war. So he was struck that the West was becoming totally nihilistic. That people stopped having children. Already in the 80s in Italy, you could see that people were stopping to have children. And that shows a lack of taste for life, that you no longer understand life as a self-gift, right? That life is not to give yourself, but life is to possess yourself in a bourgeois sense, right? So the contrast to that was the willingness of the young Iranians to go to die for the fatherland, right? Because at this point, already in the 80s in Europe, very few people were prepared to die for the fatherland or the motherland, or whatever you want to call it, because again, that requires a sense of sharing some kind of common ideal, a national ideal, or all these things to the Noce are related. family, country, religion, it's a cliche, but they are related because they all imply that the individual fulfills his life by belonging to something greater, right? To belonging to the family, belonging to the nation, belonging to the church, to the point that you could even conceivably give your life for one of these things. Now, from an individualistic bourgeois perspective, these things don't make much sense. That's why, the modern Western man is cosmopolitan. If you take a liberal from New York, he's at home in London, he's at home in Milan, in Frankfurt. He appreciates this cosmopolitan international culture of cooking, of tourism, of fitness, of all these things are international. You see, he finds himself more in common with these people than with somebody from Iowa, right? The person from Iowa, in principle, is a fellow countryman, but what does it mean to the bourgeois? It doesn't mean much, because there is not a sense that the nation is a significant unit, because there is no ideal foundation. The nation is kind of an archaic, passé form of organization that from a capitalist perspective doesn't make much sense. It's the age of globalization, but not just globalization of production, but globalization of lifestyles, right? That's the bourgeois. Same thing for religion. What does it mean to belong to this church or that church? And also, okay, the family is another issue too. That the family that is no longer an expression of some sacramental bond. It's no longer an idea that is binding, but it is just a road to individual fulfillment. If it doesn't work, we change it. There is nothing there that in some sense, your fulfillment does not require yourself to bind yourself. Your fulfillment requires yourself to unbind. And when you do this across the board, all forms of social organization become hollow. They emptied out, right? You know what I mean?
So Del Noce, correct me if I'm wrong, he passes away in '89, right? So this is just as the conflict and the Cold War is ending. So he's not around to see and comment upon, the kind of free world hegemony, right? The Pax Americana.
He didn't see he died in a few weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall, so he saw that. And 2 weeks before dying, he wrote this article you can find online called Marxism died in the East because it triumphed in the West, which is kind of, if you Google, you can find it. It is a very, I don't think he made up the title, but the title is reasonably faithful to what he says. Anyway, so he didn't see it come to fruition, but he saw it coming. He was very prophetic because he understood the philosophical logic. He understood that the Western culture already since the early 60s, as I said before, since the early 60s had taken this direction. And so already in the early 60s, he kind of said that Marxism had been defeated as a revolutionary force, not as a relativistic, materialistic philosophy, but as a revolutionary force. Already in the 60s, looking at the Soviet Union, looking at the Eastern Bloc, said, okay, you see, Marxism failed. And he also diagnosed the Western response as we described it, right? So even if he didn't see the Pax Americana, he saw very well the birth and development of the culture that then would ultimately lead to the Pax Americana.
So take us through a little bit, Del Noce hasn't been around the last 30 years to comment, but given that he could foresee and saw certain things already develop so well, there's a great passage where he talks about risorgimento, is how he calls it, of a culture can only sort of revive when it goes back and discovers its eternal values, its eternal ideals. I think back in some ways to the book of Huntington of the Clash of Civilizations, where he makes an argument that you see cultures now in the unipolar world turning away from the old ideological battle lines of liberal world, free world, and communism, and looking back to their civilization. So China makes a Confucian pivot. India makes a Hindu dharmic pivot, whatever you want to call it. That there's kind of these different locuses that are picking up on a tradition. I mean, is there a risorgimento going on, or is it maybe something more superficial ultimately than that?
Well, that would be nice, but if there is, it's still in embryonic state, because you see, to go back to the quote you read before about colonialism to the Noce is really an expression of the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment, the Enlightenment had this idea of this universal technical scientific progress and to bring it from Europe to the rest of the world. But in its latest expression, this idea of the Enlightenment has been applied to our own culture. I mean, there is this attempt to kind of purify our own culture from religious superstition, from sexual bigotry, from racism, all these things that in some sense could be corrected. I'm not questioning that, but the Noce sees the Western culture as this kind of a war of the Enlightenment against its own past. In the Western world, the Enlightenment culture, which is in a sense what liberalism means now, because today, in the last 50 years, liberalism means the culture of the Enlightenment after Marxism, right? This kind of post-Marxist Enlightenment culture is what we call liberalism, is at war with the origins of our civilization. There is no question that, that, as I said before, a Western liberal is more at home with this cosmopolitan, enlightened, technical, sexually liberated culture than with the traditional culture you find. I don't know where the traditional culture is, but I don't know if you go to Louisiana or some, or to other places that are more peripheral. Apparently, there are still places where that hold on to certain ideals, but the division is internal, not external, right? And so this culture of the new Enlightenment is trying to do a kind of internal colonization through education, through mass media, to bring everybody on board with this project. So if you ask me if anybody is rediscovering or proposing the founding ideals, whatever they were, because America, in a sense, if you talk, America is different from Europe, but in the United States, the Enlightenment factor was there from the beginning, except that, in a sense, America was based on the idea that you could have a reconciliation of the Enlightenment and Protestantism, right? There was these two big streams, the Protestant evangelical tradition of the free churches and the Enlightenment culture. I think Jefferson and Adams, or, So it's a good question. If America needs to rediscover its founding ideas, in some sense, that would require a rebirth of Protestant ideas. But at this point, it seems to me that, by and large, the Enlightenment side of America has prevailed. I mean, I could be wrong, but in many ways, it's at least right now, it seems to be prevalent. So I don't see any risorgimento coming out of that. European countries are different because some of them have Catholic roots, some of them have, but now there is a new Catholics in the United States. If Catholics are faithful to their own idea, in some places that would be a risorgimento, because that's what started the culture. I mean, I'm Italian. In Italy, of course, if you want to reconstruct the national tradition, you go back to Dante and the Middle Ages. So that would be a risorgimento. But every country is different. So I mean, although for Europe there was this common medieval Christian theme that could be rediscovered, but if you ask me if it is being rediscovered, I'm not sure.
Is there a perhaps a Del Noce style analysis that could be made of some of our more recent phenomena? I think of, since 2016, Trump and Brexit and the sort of establishment of I guess, a nationalism, you might call it, an illiberal right.
Yeah. The Noce finds nationalists to be an ambiguous phenomenon. Okay, ambiguous because, in a sense, it does express a desire to discover the roots of a country, to go back to its beginning, but it can take place without really going back to the ideal roots, but just affirming the nation for the nation's sake as a sort of tribalism, right? That you belong to a tribe, you belong to a group, without really understanding whatever were the ideal factors, the religious, philosophical ideas that brought the tribe together in the first place. So he says somewhere that, nationalism can be a misunderstanding of the idea of tradition. And what it means, I think, is that the idea of a correct idea of tradition is not about superficial elements, but it is about certain eternal truths that people used to recognize together, right? The truth that what it means to be human being, what is the family, what are the religious questions and their role in society. Okay, all these are things that can be factors in a tradition. Nationalism is a bit of a shortcut, a short circuit in the sense that it can happen not by going to the depth of these ideas, but just by affirming America. All right, yeah, but what makes America America? You have to, if it is just that us against them, or just, it could make things worse. Because when there is an ideology, one of the worst things you can do is to produce a counter ideology. In fact, that's what happens very often. If you think of, again, the prototype was Stalinism and Nazism, but there are many other examples in which people respond to a very ideological, crude worldview with a counter ideological, crude worldview, and usually it makes things even worse. It's very easy to make things even worse.
Does conservatism fit that paradigm of being a?
Well, to the Noce, he talks about conservatives, but he does not have an experience of what the word means in the American context. And he says that it has 2 or 3 different meanings in the book, and he explains that it could just be a sort of believing that let's not make things worse, let's not rock the boat. What we have is the result of history. It's probably as good as we can get. Let's not try too hard to improve, because we are probably going to make it worse. To him, this is not very significant, very useful in the long term. There is a form of conservatism which is skeptical, kind of a skeptical empiricist type of conservatism in the English-speaking tradition, of which is not particularly fond of. The Noce did not have his own ism in some sense. He was a traditionalist in some sense, but he really thought that tradition is not just what happened in the past. Tradition is the eternal value of what happened in the past, which has to be separated from what was inadequate and not eternal in what happened to the past. So just to prolong in the past is not particularly useful. You have to be critical and understand what was the good value that was understood in the past that has to be preserved, as opposed to the things in the past that actually should be discarded, because there is always things in the past that need to be discarded. So this kind of critical work calls into question a lot of conservatism in a simplified sense of the word. You know what I mean?
Yes. So I think of Russia, for example, as in some ways has posed itself as a principle of tradition in today's world stage, standing up to the decadent West with kind of eternal,
yes,
spiritual values, but maybe.
That's one of the striking essays in the book. There is that essay called "The Death of the Sacred," written in 1970, so 20 years before the fall of the Soviet Union, in which the Noce says, well, okay, the Soviet Union is theoretically communist, but culturally, Russia is still a sacred idea of politics, of a certain myth, the third Rome, and the historical mission of the Russian people. You can question all these things as much as you want, but these are myths in a sense. Narratives, ideas that will hold the country together. While in the West, they're all gone, right? So in this sense, that's why, as I said before, he saw America as more of a disintegrating culture than Russian culture. Even if Russia was falling apart in material sense, the Soviet Union as a state, as a economic unit was in big trouble. But he said that culturally, Russian still has a unifying myth that will probably endure. And I think there was some truth to that, because if you see now, Russia is still more of a country in good and bad ways, because then you can have, again, nationalism in a bad way. You can have some kind of chauvinism, right? I mean, everything can go bad, but it's still more of a country, of a sense of belonging to a nation that you find in many Western countries, I think.
There's been a sense in which perhaps Islam has had some form of this as well, right? The drive, as we hinted earlier with Khomeini, but the drive for people to join ISIS worldwide, isn't it sort of a rallying around a sort of principle of this?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because in one sense, certainly political Islam is a reaction to the West, is the attempt to have a glue, cultural, religious glue that can preserve a people. On the other hand, some authors have also pointed out that there is something very ideological to political Islam that makes it resemble certain Western patterns, right? And I'm no expert on this either, but it's a good question. I think it can go both ways again.
And it strikes me that perhaps, with the overtures to Confucianism, there's a bit of an attempt for this in China. And with Hindu nationalism in India, though of course,
definitely,
like you said, is it ultimately?
Definitely. Although now, the new Chinese president seems to be trying to go back to Marxism in some sense, isn't he? I don't know. I don't follow closely, but yeah, absolutely.
And I bring those examples up because there are authors today, including a Russian like Alexander Dugin, who has sort of this idea of a multipolar world of different traditions, right? So you'd have the kind of Iranian, the Russian, and the Indian, and they could all kind of be their own thing in a multipolar world and stand, over against liberalism, I guess. But again, it's unclear to me how much this.
Yeah, the West is the idea. In this picture, the West is the bad guy. In a sense, the West is the one that is colonizing the rest of the world. I mean, I'm sure there is some truth to that, but some of these responses again can unaware import some of what they're trying to fight. Also religion can be used ideologically. Even Russian Orthodox, if there is not a genuine spiritual renewal, a genuine literally artistic human flourishing, it can just become another ideology. This is what happened in Europe already in other ages. So yes, I agree. These are all responses again to this kind of Western disintegration. Whether they have the potential to produce real new life and to regenerate the nations where they come from, it remains to be seen. There is nothing mechanical.
As a final question here, and then I'll let you go. Do you see any hopeful signs in the West of sort of seeds of risorgimento along, whether it's religious revival of any sort or anything of that nature that encourages you for kind of a rebirth and continuity of the eternal dimension of tradition, as you described?
Yeah, well, I think there is certainly one good thing is that people don't harbor many illusions anymore on the Western project. I mean, I can see that young people have become more realistic. They understand that in some sense the Western experiment at some human level has failed. Okay, I mean, they can see that there is still material prosperity and there is still some degree of social freedom and democracy, but they see that all these things are in danger because the human background, the human root has become so much weaker. So people have become more aware of this, and I think they are searching. And so in this respect, it's very important that for instance, Christians and Catholics and people of goodwill propose what they have, because people are searching. I don't know. I mean, when I grew up, I was very much helped by, by Giussani or by Catholic movements in Italy. We had the 2 or 3 good Catholic movements in Italy that are still supporting life. But what I would say is that before this renewal movements come to political fruition, it's going to take a very long time. Because politics is the ultimate expression of culture, but if the cultural work is not done in renewing communities and ideas and life and the family, then politics is not going to fill in, step in, make up what's missing. Right? So sometimes people go for the political shortcut. I think that we can solve these problems politically. I am personally skeptical. I think it's going to be a long and slow rebuilding, and that one has to focus on that.
So hard work, but hopeful work ahead.
Yes, I mean, you need to. Everybody needs to find context in which the spiritual and social life can be sustained. Okay, and this is, I think, the good intuition in the Benedict option. Then it doesn't. But the focus must be on education, to educate and to preserve. One doesn't need to be obsessed about the coming collapse. It could take a long time. It's not that the world is going to end tomorrow. And there is this totalitarian trends, clearly, that are typical of modernity, and they're picking up steam again. But even those, one cannot focus on them too much. One has to focus on the positive reconstruction, in my opinion, and the resources, the cultural resources are there, the spiritual resources are there. For Catholics, the sacramental resources are there. One has to take advantage of them and do the work, and not think too far in the future, because at this point, the future is really out of our control.
Excellent. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Carlo, for joining the conversation today.
Oh, thank you for having me.